We are back in action with our next panel debate. But before that, I want to bring you up to date with another key finding from that Transatlantic Trends Survey. Now, this one is focusing on managing relations with Russia and also with China. And once we get that slide up on screen, it will show you that when it comes to the respondents, in most EU member states, well, it turns out they prefer working through the EU, through the European Union, rather than working through NATO. And these figures, what they represent, what they mean is when it comes to managing relations with either, say, Russia, only 9% of the respondents chose to do it through the United States, and only 11% wanted to manage relations with China through the United States. So it builds on that previous key finding that we brought to you about the slide, the projected slide in influence when it comes to the US sphere of influence. All of this we're showing you in order to guide you through the next conversation. So just have that in the back of your mind, especially when you're formulating your questions, because these are key findings from the Transatlantic Trends study. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming onto the stage for his panel, which will be discussing gazing at each other or facing the same direction. Bear that in mind. Please welcome on stage Christoph Heusgen, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, who will lead this ministerial panel discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. Wonderful to be here. Before I start the panel, let me thank the organizers. Let me thank Katarina Pisarska from the Warsaw Security Forum. She has been a Munich young leader, and we are very happy to have this relationship between the Munich Security Conference and the Warsaw Security Forum. I'm very impressed by what you have put up here, Katarina. Thank you for this. Now, we are under strict time restrictions. The clock is working, so no introductions. We go right into the subject. Senator, you have been in Parliament, in Congress for 15 years, I believe. Have you seen a more happy and a more homogeneous NATO during this period?
Well, let me thank the hosts for convening this panel. Looking forward to it. Listen, I think it's always been fashionable to write the obituary of the Transatlantic Alliance. It seems like we're constantly in crisis, but we constantly find a way to remember the reasons for our genesis. And obviously, this is an existential threat to the alliance, and it is, I think, so important to show the world that we are able to step up and meet this challenge. And so, in the United States, I don't think we've ever seen the kind of support for NATO as we do today. We obviously are coming off of a bit of a hangover with a president who found political gain to be had in coming after the alliance. That opportunity doesn't exist any longer because there are Ukrainian flags flying all over the United States and great support for this deep integration with our European partners. But even before the Ukraine crisis, I think we had rallied around the notion that if we didn't find a way to cooperate more deeply, both on a security basis and an economic basis, China was going to own the rules of the road, the operating system for the world economy. And so, I think so much of our focus today is on supporting Ukraine, and I'm glad that we have found ways to do that. I think we also have discovered that if we aren't working together in a seamless web, we are also gifting the future world order to the Chinese. So for multiple reasons, this is an alliance that is as strong as ever before, and you see broad support for it, probably more substantial than ever before in the United States Congress.
Thank you. Thank you for this, Madame le Député. Ms. Poussirev, you are a member of the party of the President, La République En Marche, or Renaissance. The President, at some stage, described NATO as brain dead. I think he has changed that. How happy are you right now with NATO and the alliance? And if I can add the second part of this, European sovereignty, where do we stand there, and how do you see this is pursued?
Yes. I would say that NATO has changed since this sentence was pronounced by French President Macron. I think at that time there was a kind of ambiguity that has been lifted, and we have seen it recently when NATO gave this very swift response to the war in Ukraine, and we have been all united, and without first the bravery of the Ukrainian soldiers, of course, the resistance of the Ukrainian people, but without NATO, without I would say the strong political sanctions which were put on Russia. Maybe Russia, Putin would have found his way to Ukraine. So we can only be very positive that NATO has strengthened its posture, and this is what we were waiting for, I must say, because as you know, France is cooperating actively to NATO. We have more than 1,500 people, soldiers involved either in NATO response force or being a framework nation in Romania. We are doing air policing in Poland. We are part of the enhanced presence in the Baltic states. So I think our commitment is total, and we value the cooperation we have within NATO, and we think this is really the answer. And we always thought, anyway, NATO is the cornerstone of the collective security, of our collective security. And just to answer the second question, it's certainly not the time to oppose long-term plan. We can have to build up our strength in Europe, our sovereignty. It's not the time to oppose this long-term plan with the response to the present situation and what we have to the support we have to provide to Ukrainian forces, and it's not only military support, of course, political support, but we should not oppose European sovereignty and NATO. We have to look for a better articulation. We have to look for instance, increased maritime presence, coordinated maritime presence, and I could go on like that very long time, but I think that's enough for now.
Okay, well, maybe we come back to this. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for attending here today. I know you are under a lot of time pressure there. Now, you have a new Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister, when I followed the news, was just changing her policy on taxes. And how about the defense area? As Secretary of Defense, do you count on continuing the course that you led during the last years under Prime Minister Johnson, or do you expect changes there?
Well, I mean, I think that first and foremost, the Prime Minister is wedded to the pledge of 3% of GDP by 2030 and 2.5% of GDP in 2026. And in doing so, we first of all joined the 16 countries that have pledged to increase their defense spending since Ukraine was invaded. A timely declaration by many of those countries. You know, for us, we were already at 2%. We'd had an extra £24 billion in the lead up before Ukraine was invaded. But you know, I think we should all be asking ourselves the question of how can we not, you know, we can't afford not to be funding at higher levels than even 2% by 2030. And I think the trajectory we need to be on is to recognize that both, in a sense, locally, e.g. within Europe, Russia is a much more dangerous adversary than I think we all thought it might be. It is proactive, not only in waging a war in Europe and disregarding human rights and international laws. We've also seen threats. We've obviously seen the mysterious, so far, explosions around the gas pipeline and other measures taking place wider field. Wagner Group aggressively in West Africa, pushing legitimate UN, or trying to push out legitimate UN missions, and indeed the EU and missions out of places like Mali. And then on the other side of the world in the Pacific, a China ever growing in not only establishing itself, but a desire to challenge. President Xi himself talks about challenging the concepts of democracy and indeed those values that we hold so dear. So I don't see under my government, and my government has approximately two and a bit years left to run before the next election, and I don't see that changing under my government. In fact, this Prime Minister came to win the election as Prime Minister because of those pledges were part of it. That's why, for example, I supported her as well as I thought she was the best candidate. So, no, we're planning on increasing investing in defence, and it's about time. After 30 years, many of our nations in Europe, we went from taking a peace dividend in 1991 to all our treasuries basically becoming corporate raiders and carrying on taking out of the defence budgets. Well, you pay for that in the end, and I think all of us will discover, well, I know because I speak to my colleagues around Europe, that all of us know that under the bonnet, the hollowing out that we've all experienced in our defence budgets for the last 20-odd years, where on the surface our militaries can boast numbers, but below that bonnet we have not enough infrastructure, not enough spare parts, not enough personnel, not enough modern weaponry, not enough weapon stocks. That's all coming home to roost, and we're going to have to deal with that, and that is going to cost money.
Yes, thank you very much, Secretary. And you were very kind not to point out, for instance, my country, Germany, which certainly thought that the peace dividend and fell back in defense spending, but now trying to make up. But I see that there is a lot of alignment. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned Africa. And while we are sitting here, and this is my impression from all the discussions, that we are very united, at NATO we are very united supporting Ukraine. Russia, back there in Africa, is advancing. Russia has basically, taking over with its Wagner troop parts of Mali, now the latest coup d'etat in Burkina Faso. There's also apparently Russians behind this. Are we doing enough to counter this? And maybe, Madam Deputy, can I ask you first on this? This is an area where France was very active, and now, without much notice, Russia is gaining ground there. Are we doing enough to counter this?
At least France tried to have, to give support to countries when they called France to act, and it was a request from Mali in 2013, and we were there to try to support the government in place, to provide more security, to bring back the law order in some villages. And the situation completely changed because of what, as you mentioned, because of Russian interference. And it has been the case previously in Central Africa, and now it's regarding Burkina Faso. And so we have been very impacted by the Wagner behavior, which is beyond what is acceptable. And there was a lot done by them on the information side. This is where we should have been, I think, personally think, we should have been more active in the informational war that has been taking place in Africa. As for France, we did the best we could. We are redeploying our system over there, and we will still be involved in fighting against terrorism, together with our allies, of course, and we thank Great Britain for the support they had provided to Barkhane with the Chinook helicopters. So we still have to talk about Africa, and France is still very active in Mediterranean region, in Middle East as well, and this is something I wanted to stress. We are keeping an eye on what is happening elsewhere, and I would say globally.
Yes, I would like to pick up there, Senator. When you are at the UN and when you have discussions there, it is totally different when you have it at NATO or here at Warsaw. There is a lot of talk about double standards, and there's a lot of equidistance. Are we doing enough? Is the US, do you think that you are doing enough also in Africa or Latin America? Is it to win over the government there? Because I'm afraid one of these days, in the UN General Assembly, the Chinese will get a majority there, and with their thinking. So while we have this wonderful alliance, outside the world is going into different directions. Do you have that on your radar screen? Yeah.
Well, of course we do, and for the United States and frankly our European partners, for us all to be a credible voice supporting democracy and human rights around the world, we need to be willing to both talk the talk and walk the walk. And listen, unfortunately, administration after administration, the United States sort of exposes itself with some pretty clearly hypocritical behavior. And so, I have counseled this administration, all friends, to be more consistent in their policy towards the Middle East. If we're going to be serious about democracy, if we're going to be serious about human rights, then we, frankly, have to have some tougher conversations and draw some more difficult lines with countries that have, engaged in some pretty serious repressive behavior. In Africa, I think we are viewing the consequence of the United States continuing to look at the continent through a security-only lens. We have spent 5 times as much money padding the budgets of security agencies as we do trying to midwife economic development. As we do trying to fight corruption and build good governance, and we end up funding security forces that are corrupt, that are abusing their own people, giving opportunities to Russians and the Chinese to come in and fill the vacuum. And so, while I agree that this is a moment where we have to understand the need to bolster our conventional defensive capabilities, it's also a reminder that we simply don't have the economic development and pro-democracy tools that we need to have in places like Africa, and a reminder that if we want to be a credible fulcrum to organize the world community around the protection of democracy and human rights, we have to occasionally draw some tough lines with some of our autocratic allies.
Mr. Secretary, do you also see Africa as a challenge for British foreign policy, British development policy? Is this something that you have also on your radar screen, again, seeing that we are here united, but there are people who look at this conflict differently. They only see that the price of energy goes up and food crisis, and they say, well, it is the old East-West conflict, and we just want to, we just want these big guys to solve it, but we are suffering. How do we respond enough to that?
I think that's more of I'm afraid, a German population response. If you look at polls in France and Britain and large parts of Europe, the population overwhelmingly supports the efforts that people are doing in Ukraine, whether that's military aid or non-military aid. And yes, and the polls even show they are prepared to pay the prices on their fuel bills, difficult as that is. because I think they see that it won't go away on its own. They know that in the end, Putin is going to carry on using energy as a weapon. But I think Africa is interesting because it is effectively the perfect stage, really, for all the sort of threats that we face. I often used to say to people, you don't have to go to the Pacific to compete with China. You only have to go to Africa. If you overlay the map of Russian Wagner interests, Russian military arms sales, Russian dirty money with Chinese mineral interests, with extremism in Africa, and you lay it on a map, it's quite a worrying map, because very often you see whole countries who are subject to all three competitions, and that doesn't bode well for many of those countries. And I used to often talk with Florence Parly, my counterpart, a lot, because we were doing our bit in security in Mali, as you rightly said, but we used to both agree the Algeria agreement that had been put in place and brokered by the French, this is also a challenge for the UN. Africa, where was the nation building to accompany the effort that we were doing? The UN had its obligations in the Algeria agreement about education and de-radicalizing people. And if the nation building doesn't happen in parallel with the security, you're absolutely right, you'll just go backwards. And, I think that the French took the right decision, that it was just becoming a tragic loss of life for French soldiers and other European soldiers. And for what? Because I think the 2 military coups happened, etc. So I think it's a challenge for us all. I think all of us know in today's 21st century, security is not just about hard power. It is about nation building. It is about making sure, it is about poverty. It is about migration challenges. And we have to invest in countries. So using the dollar, using the euro and the pound to actually invest alongside our security is the long-term challenge. But when you invest with the dollar, pound, or euro, that's when you bump up against the yen or the ruble, because it's doing it at a discount, often without any concerns about the human rights of the country or who they're putting their yen in or ruble in the back pocket. And we all have, quite rightly, corruption laws and issues. So we have to find a way of not only helping some of those countries, but demonstrating why it is the better route. And we're not always that good at doing that. We need to get better at it. We need to be, take ourselves into, be more competitive, but better at how we are going to make sure that when a country, let's say in East Africa, a British company is competing with a Chinese company, that the Chinese company isn't building the swimming pool of the guy who's making the contract and everything else. But we need to find a way to be better at it.
Yeah, we cannot dwell on this, but I think this is a very important point. When China, everything is in one hand. They build the presidential palace, they do the financing, and they build personnel, and we don't have a system that matches it. So, but this is not for. We have not talked about one country, or only briefly, and this is China. When the U.S. administration started, also for us here, China was the one big challenge. Now, Putin has gotten all the attention, but in the back there looms China. The president will kind of change the Chinese constitution by getting a third term, and the country is more authoritarian. Are we ready for this competition? How do you, Mr. Senator, how do you see this playing out right now? To a certain degree, Xi took distance from Putin in the SCO summit by expressing some concerns, but basically he's pursuing his goal there, and Russia and China and the UN have been working hand in hand. How concerned are you with China after the Congress, after Xi is prolonged, and I said on Taiwan, and where do you see also a role for, or do you see a role for your NATO allies there?
Well, I think the first thing is to not become China's hype men, right? I mean, China's, 10 feet tall, not 30 feet tall. I mean, zero COVID has been disaster. Their economic growth rate this year appears to be cataclysmic compared to what their expectations were. Their wolf warrior diplomacy has boomeranged on them and frankly convinced many countries in Europe and around the world that they would be better off being more skeptical about unconditional economic and political alliance with China. So, this is a moment in which I think we have to be realistic about the opportunities that frankly come with great power competition, not just the downsides. I mean, listen, I think the future of relations with China run through our ability to build seamless cooperation between the United States and Europe. And so I am gladdened by our increasing discussions around trade and technology. If we're going to have an industrial policy in the United States, which I think we are on our way towards, boy, it makes no sense to do that unilaterally. We should be building a common industrial policy with Europe. It doesn't make sense for Europe to move out way ahead of us on technology regulation. Better for us to set the standard together. So I think China delights when we are setting different standards, when we are creating parallel industrial policies. I think they know they're in for a much rougher ride when we're acting together. And frankly, to this question we were discussing before about how you present an offer to countries that right now are allured by the free money with no strings attached from China, creating a seamless market between the United States and Europe, right? Creating an easy plug-in to the transatlantic economy for countries in China, countries in Africa as a alternative to an economic alliance with China is the future as well. So to me, let's be realistic about the threat that's presented by China, and let's understand that the closer we are cooperating in all matters between the United States and Europe, the more easily we can manage China's rise.
No, thank you very much. Also, this call for cooperation. It's hard to see from here, but questions. Would like to take questions from the audience. Who is? Yes, there are a few there. Please go ahead. And there should be a mic for you, and maybe you introduce yourself and tell us to whom you direct your question. Yeah.
In the meantime, I would just like to take the opportunity to talk about the farm initiative, in fact, because it's a response. I don't know if you're familiar with the farm initiative, is to make sure that African countries and other countries will be provided with food. And this was initiated under the French EU presidency. And I think this is an answer also to to what China could, the influence that China could gain into this crisis if we let them the only one to support these developing countries.
Yeah, and there is, of course, a global gateway program of the European Union where we have to put beef on. So yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Jakub Graca. I'm an analyst of international relations for the Institute of New Europe in Warsaw. I have one question to Senator Murphy. Based on building on what you have said about countries that are making it easier for China and Russia to have access to the free world, I would like to point at Hungary, because Hungary is a very specific country that is part of NATO, part of the European Union. But on the other hand, Hungary, would you agree that agree or rather say that Hungary is fully on board when it comes to support for Ukraine and when it comes to our common stance on Russia? Because I, for one, don't think so. Looking at what Hungary is doing, it's not about Hungary as the country, but it's about the government of Viktor Orban. Because they are, in my opinion, they are to a large extent undermining our common stance on Russia and Ukraine. And what can we do to help Hungary divert to the right path And because I have an impression that Hungary is getting away with what the government of Viktor Orban is getting away with everything. The US, the last time when the US did something on that matter was during Barack Obama's term. And these were limited sanctions when it comes to, during Trump's administration, nothing was done. And now, during Biden's, also the US is silent on Hungary. So if you could please delve into this and elaborate on that, I would be grateful.
Well, I mean, listen, there's no doubt that often Hungary has a very different agenda than the rest of the NATO alliance, but we are also a big, diverse alliance, and we are constantly going to have, robust discussions inside about our priorities. I think to the extent that you don't see the Biden administration speaking out at the level that you may wish is because right now, this administration rightly wants to stay in line, wants to stay coordinated with our NATO allies. And if there is a decision to be made about the future of the alliance, who's in or who's out, that's got to be a decision that is made collectively. Because there's nothing that Putin wants more than for this alliance to splinter, than for this alliance to turn inward and have all of its focus be on who's playing by the rules and who isn't. That's not to say that we shouldn't have tough conversations with Hungary or other members of the alliance who start to stray from our values or start to stray from the strategic direction. But I just think we have to be careful about playing Putin's game. And we have to be careful as the United States about getting out front of our allies who frankly live right next door to Hungary, who have to deal with them and integrate their economies with Hungary in a way that we don't. I think it's not good for us and not good for the alliance for us to be getting far too out front rhetorically from our partners.
Thank you for this. Next question. Yes, please. I think you have to go to the microphone, I assume, which is over there. And maybe the next one who asks a question, yes, further, a bit further, and then to the right.
I was really hoping that you'd get the Hungary question, so,
What I can say on Hungary is, throughout this whole process, Hungary hasn't once blocked any efforts by NATO or the alliance to tackle what's going on in Ukraine. And what you often find amongst defense ministers is actually beneath the posturing and the foreign policy that all the foreign policy ministers clearly do in NATO and things like that, the defense ministers are sort of workmanlike and get on with it. And I went to visit Hungary not so long ago, and, they've absolutely been in lockstep with the 30 in NATO. And that says a lot, right? I mean, that's actions rather than words. Yes, I know there are issues around Hungary and its relationships with minorities and its relationships into the European Commission and stuff, and I fully understand that. But, when as far as Russia concerns, yeah, they're not front of the line, they're not number one hawk in town. But, the great thing about an alliance, and it is a strength, is that we can all go at different speeds, and we have on Ukraine. We've all got there, but I think, we don't all have to turn up on day one exactly thinking the same thing and exactly doing the same thing at the same time, except in an Article 5 incident if Russia were to invade us as a member. So I think, I would judge Hungary on its actions when it comes to Ukraine. Yes, it's not front and center, but it hasn't stopped, and NATO can be used to do all sorts of things. If you want to play individual sort of vetoes, it hasn't done any of that.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you. Dominic Nichols from the Telegraph of London. For all panel members, please, in terms of reinvigorating the NATO alliance, which world leader has done more, Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump? And if the alliance is reinvigorated and needs to look east, do you think it's time that partners such as Australia are promoted from observer status to actual members? Thank you.
This was directed to anybody. Madame la députée.
Well, no comment on Donald Trump, but no, definitely the alliance is revigorated, and the strength of an alliance is that it has the ability to deter and to be credible. So now it's is a transatlantic alliance. I'm sure we have other challenges in the Indo-Pacific, but it's not about maybe extending NATO mission to Indo-Pacific. As the senator said, it's more about how United States and other European nations can cooperate more effectively in this area, especially at sea, and I'm including, of course, Great Britain, and with the support of our Australian friends. And it's such a wide area that we have so many challenges that we should maybe articulate our Navy forces a bit more, I would say, tightly. And we have to step up our efforts in the field of Navy forces, because, as it was previously said, China has its own challenges, but it's approximately building one French Navy every 4 years. So in 2035, they will be very, very big. And so I suppose we have to prepare, get ready for any event in this area.
Mr. Secretary?
Well, brief, because I noticed the clock's ticking down. First of all, two things. It's been entirely a consistent policy of the United States under Barack Obama, under Donald Trump, and in Joe Biden, that, you know, asking Europe to pay more towards its security. I think that's an incredibly valid suggestion. You know, there is no such thing as a free lunch, and fundamentally, for decades, to some extent, the United States carried a large part of the burden. And I think that pressure, maybe articulated by some presidents in a more subtle way, maybe we say, but nevertheless was continuous. And I think that's been actually quite energizing for Europe, and many of us have known, and there are some incredibly brave countries in Europe who've taken big political risks by putting more, you know, prioritizing defense over domestic. And I think then along came the pantomime villain, President Putin, who absolutely was the most energizing thing, I think, for all of NATO in making sure that he just reminded us that there really is somebody out there who really, really wants to not only challenge us, but wants to inflict violence and subthreshold. You know, a president who clearly was engaged, or his government, in authorizing the use of nerve agent on the streets of Britain to assassinate someone and murder a British citizen is absolutely, in a sense, a gift to NATO. If NATO ever wondered what it was there for, well, you have the embodiment of it, and that's why I think it's been energized, and it is already started. It was already starting to reform, but it knows exactly where the line between good and bad is. And you know, we are in it. We're in the good side. I believe it, and we are now coming together. And all of us are reforming our militaries and getting that wake-up call. That U.S. presidents, to be fair, they're always on. Sacco and others would always remind us about our readiness wasn't good enough. It wasn't. You know, we had troops on paper, but were we really ready? And we're all going to be ready soon, because that's the lesson we've all learned.
I'll take the bait on the Trump bit for 30 seconds. You know, I think what's interesting is that in real time, to give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening in American politics today, President Trump is market testing his old messages of criticism and hostility to the Transatlantic Alliance. Some of his allies are sort of putting out messages of skepticism about continuing to fund Ukraine, but they're not landing. One of his chief allies put out a statement yesterday or the day before criticizing the $12 billion supplemental appropriation that Congress made, and within about 30 seconds, the post was removed because Americans see in a brand new way the value of this alliance. And these attacks, which I think were successful in the past on the value of staying true to the alliance, I just don't think work the way that they might have 6 years ago. And so Yes, I think in many ways, Vladimir Putin and his attack on Ukraine has renewed Americans' vigor for the alliance, and I think has diminished the impact politically of candidates who might think that they can score points by trying to argue for America's resources to come back home. So certainly an opportunity here to grow American support for the alliance, support that will hold the test of time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Senator. We are 2 minutes over time, and I don't want to bring any problems to our partners, Warsaw Security Forum. So let's end on this very positive note. Senator, I think that was maybe the most important message, at least I took from here, that this commitment, the US, that also from the polls you conduct, that this is something durable. For us, Europeans here, we must not fall back to what we did before into complacency. We have to do our homework. We have to commit to the 2%, and we have to see to it that NATO, the alliance, functions, and within NATO, also the European Security Cooperation works within NATO. So thank you all very much. That has been very pleasant to be here in this board, and we were 3 minutes late. I hope we'll be forgiven. Thank you.